Dallin, look at your brother as an example, my mother sneered before 30 elite guests. I didn't flinch. I just smiled and whispered, "Then the bills are all his." I walked out. 5 minutes later, the lights died, the heating failed, and my phone became a graveyard of 36 missed calls from a family that finally realized their golden son was broke. I sat in the shivering silence of the driver's seat, watching the frost crawl up the glass, realizing that a man's character is forged in the moments he refuses to be a victim. My mind drifted back to the start of the night, before the mask fell, when the only sound was the winter wind. The tires of my sedan crunched over the fresh, biting Illinois snow as Kaylee and I pulled into the sweeping driveway of the Vaughn estate. In Lake Forest, Christmas isn't just a holiday, it's a performance of status. And tonight, the house was glowing with a warm, amber light that suggested a peace we all knew didn't exist. I stared at the grand colonial facade, thinking of the old stoic truth that a man's worth is never found in the bricks and mortar he inhabits, but in the quiet strength of his character. Still, the wind outside was relentless, a sharp contrast to the staged perfection behind the glass. Kaylee reached over, her fingers lacing through mine, her grip a silent anchor in a sea of impending pretense. "We don't have to stay long, Dallin," she whispered. I nodded, though I knew the script had already been written. I wasn't just coming home for dinner. I was stepping back into a role I had played for 30 years, the invisible son. Walking through the heavy oak doors, the scent of expensive pine and aged scotch hit me like a physical weight. The foyer was buzzing with 30 of Chicago's elite, the air thick with the clinking of crystal and the low hum of practiced laughter. My mother, Maris, and my father, Vaughn, stood at the center of the room, radiant in their roles as the perfect hosts. When Maris spotted me, she offered a perfunctory nod, the kind you give a distant acquaintance you've forgotten the name of. Her eyes immediately darted back to the door, scanning the shadows for the person who truly mattered. I realized then that I haven't been forgotten. I've been erased. It's a strange feeling, being a ghost in the house that your own hard work at the firm quietly maintains. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who share your blood and felt like a complete stranger? I've always believed that true generosity is doing something for someone who will never find out. It's the philosophy that guided me when I set up the family trust, ensuring the bills were paid and the roof stayed over their heads without ever demanding a thank you. As I moved through the crowd, I spotted Mrs. Gable, an old family friend, struggling with her heavy mink coat. I reached out, assisting her with a genuine smile that felt out of place in this artificial theater. "Thank you, Dallin," she breathed, patting my arm. I told her it was my pleasure, reflecting on the idea that true strength is found in how we treat those who can do nothing for us. I took a glass of water from a passing tray and retreated to the periphery, watching the stage being set for the arrival of the family king. The front door swung open with a theatrical flourish, and the temperature in the room seemed to rise as Soren stepped inside. He was draped in a tailored wool coat that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, exuding a radiant charisma that I knew was built entirely on shifting sands. The room's energy shifted instantly, a magnetic pull toward the eldest brother that left the rest of us in the shadows. Soren didn't just enter a room, he conquered it. My parents practically floated toward him, their faces lighting up with a pride they never managed to find for me. I stood back, watching the performance with a stoic detachment, knowing that a man who values his soul doesn't need to beg for a seat at a table where his worth is ignored. With the timing of a seasoned actor, Soren pulled 2 boxes from a luxury shopping bag. He presented Maris with a vintage Rolex, its gold face shimmering under the chandelier, and handed Vaughn a rare $5,000 bottle of scotch. "Only the best for the people who raised a winner," Soren announced, his voice booming with unearned confidence. The guests erupted into applause, praising his success and his legendary devotion to his parents. But as the cheers peaked, I felt a sharp vibration in my pocket. I discreetly pulled out my phone, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. It was a real-time banking notification from my high-limit business card, the one I authorized only for family emergencies. It was a massive charge, processed only minutes ago at a luxury boutique and a high-end liquor store. I looked at the gold watch on my mother's wrist and the bottle in my father's hand. The generosity everyone was cheering for had been bought with my own sweat, my own late nights in Chicago, and my own stolen credit. I didn't explode. I didn't make a scene. I simply watched as my knuckles whitened slightly around my glass. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. It is better to be a man of value than a man of success built on theft. But the sting of the betrayal was a cold, sharp blade. I realized then that the version of me they wanted, the silent provider who never asked for credit, was officially dead. The chime for dinner echoed through the house, and Maris began ushering everyone toward the formal dining room. She directed the guests with practiced precision, placing Soren in the seat of honor between her and Vaughn. When she got to me, she pointed toward the very end of the long table, a corner seat obscured by a large floral arrangement. "Dallin, you and Kaylee sit there," she said, not even looking at me. It was a public execution of my status, a tactical move to keep the unremarkable son out of the spotlight. I sat down, observing the legal irony of the situation. Under Illinois law, I was the primary owner of this estate, yet I sat like a guest at my own table. Throughout the first course, I watched my parents fawn over Soren's fabricated stories of market disruption and his visionary investments. The lies were so transparent to me, yet my parents swallowed them like fine wine. I thought about the value of truth, how a lie might run a sprint, but the truth always runs the marathon. I refused to compete for their attention, choosing instead to listen to the silence. Kaylee leaned in close, her voice a soft, urgent whisper. "Dallin, are you okay? We can leave." I looked at her, my expression as steady as a mountain. "I am not a victim of my family, Kaylee," I replied quietly. "I am a witness to their choices, and I'm starting to see exactly what needs to be done." I sat back and began to mentally review the access logs of the master account I controlled. I knew every digital footprint Soren had left, every cent he had siphoned while our parents cheered his name. As Vaughn stood up to give a toast, he ignored my presence entirely, his eyes shining with tears as he looked only at his eldest son. The atmosphere was thick with a finality I hadn't felt before. I realized that the time for quiet support had reached its end. The debt of my silence had been paid in full. Maris caught my eye across the long table, her lip curling in a familiar sneer as she leaned toward the microphone. "Dallin, try to look happy for your brother," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "Not everyone can be a provider." Maris's sneer hung in the air like a foul mist, her dismissal echoing across the crystal and silver. For a heartbeat, the room remained frozen, 30 pairs of eyes waiting for me to wither under her contempt. But the debt of my silence had been paid in full, and as I looked at her, I felt a strange, chilling clarity. I didn't feel like the discarded son anymore. I felt like a man who had finally found the exit. Vaughn stood up then, his silver spoon tapping against his crystal glass with a sharp, rhythmic ping that demanded total silence. The grand dining room, bathed in the flickering glow of the chandeliers, became a stage for a legacy built on a foundation of sand. My father began to speak, his voice thick with a pride that was never directed toward me. He talked about the Vaughn name, about the weight of history, and the brilliance required to maintain it. His gaze remained fixed on Soren, who sat at his right hand, basking in the light of unearned glory. I watched from my corner, reflecting on a core truth. A man who values his own soul does not beg for a seat at a table where his worth is actively ignored. Under the table, Kaylee's hand tightened around mine, her grip trembling with a mixture of anger and support. She was the only one in this room who knew the truth, the only warmth in a house that had turned into a tomb of pretense. Vaughn praised Soren's financial triumphs and thanked him for carrying the weight of the family. I sat there, mentally cross-referencing the Illinois joint tenancy laws and the master credit line I had just seen drained of $5,000. The very champagne my father raised in a toast was bought with the sweat of my brow, yet he credited the man who had stolen the credit. Have you ever been told you are nothing by the very people you are secretly keeping afloat? I remained silent, not out of weakness, but out of a deep-seated respect for the dignity of the truth. Even in this coldness, I leaned over and whispered a few words of encouragement to my young cousin sitting beside me, reminding him that his quiet passions had more value than any borrowed spotlight. Kindness is a debt we owe to humanity, even when the world forgets to pay it back. Then, the mood shifted. My father's eyes traveled down the long table, past the influential guests and the expensive floral arrangements, until they landed on me. The air grew heavy, the nun of 30 years of disappointment suddenly reaching its peak. "Dallin, look at your brother as an example," Vaughn said, his voice carrying a lethal edge that cut through the clinking silverware. "Soren is a provider. He is a leader. You've spent your life as a mere analyst, a man of numbers who contributes nothing to this family's glory. Learn from him, if it isn't too late for you to become a man of substance." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. I saw a few guests look down at their plates in embarrassment, while others, like Soren, smirked with a sickening sense of superiority. In that moment, the sting didn't feel like a wound, it felt like a final release. You cannot truly insult a man who has already found his own truth. I looked at my father, and instead of the shame he expected to see, I let out a short, soft laugh. It was a sound of absolute sa, a release of the chains I had worn since childhood. My smile wasn't one of mockery, but of a man who finally sees the door. Respect is earned, I thought, but self-respect is a birthright I am no longer willing to forfeit for the sake of a lie. Maris couldn't let the moment pass without adding her own poison. "You should be grateful, Dallin," she chimed in, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "Grateful that you have a brother like Soren to carry the family's weight while you hide behind your spreadsheets." I simply nodded, a gesture the guests likely interpreted as submission. But Kaylee knew better. She recognized it as the nod of a man closing a book he would never open again. Looking back now, I should have felt anger, but all I felt was a profound, weary pity for the two people who were so blinded by the flash of a stolen watch that they couldn't see the house was already on fire. I began to calculate the immediate legal ramifications of my next move. Under U.S. banking regulations, as the primary account holder of the Vaughn Trust, I possessed the absolute right to revoke any and all supplementary access. Tonight was the night the free ride ended. It occurred to me then that telling the truth is often the most painful form of love, but it is the only one capable of saving a sinking ship. I glanced at my parents, aging, fragile, and utterly convinced of their own importance, and realized that the bills I was about to present them with were more than just financial. They were the price of their own blindness. I subtly signaled Kaylee, my eyes communicating a decision that required no words. We didn't need to stay for the dessert or the false pleasantries that would surely follow. The Huadun mentioned in the quietest part of my soul was finally due for collection. I realized then that a family that demands you diminish yourself to fit their narrative is no longer a family. It is a cage. And I had the key. Dallin stood up, the wooden legs of his chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor, with a sound that felt like a thunderclap in the silent room. 30 heads turned as I looked at the head of the table. "I think I've seen enough," I said, my voice calm, steady, and devoid of the bitterness they expected, "to know exactly where everyone stands." Maris's face froze in a mask of bewilderment as I spoke those final words, but I didn't wait for her to recover. I felt the air in the dining room thicken with a tension so heavy it was nearly impossible to breathe. I needed air, but more than that, I needed a moment of absolute stillness to process the shift in the atmosphere. With a graceful, silent nod to Kaylee, I accepted the errand Maris had barked at me earlier, to fetch a rare vintage from the cellar. It was a clear attempt to exile me from the important table, a task designed to remind me of my place as the help. I accepted it with a stoic smile, because I knew the shadows of the basement were more honest than the light of that dining room. Stepping away from the chatter, I descended the creaking wooden stairs. The air grew progressively colder, smelling of damp earth, aged oak, and the stale secrets of a house that had stood for generations. In the quiet of the basement, I finally felt the surface tension of the party begin to dissipate. I've always found peace in the lower levels of a building. The foundation is where you see the truth of a structure. As I moved toward the wine racks, my eyes caught a glint of water near my father's old workbench. A pipe was weeping. Despite the insults Vaughn had hurled at me just minutes ago, I instinctively reached for a wrench and tightened the valve. A man doesn't stop caring for the home just because the residents have forgotten how to be kind. I moved deeper into the storage area, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. On a high shelf, I spotted Vaughn's old inhaler, discarded and covered in a fine layer of dust. I picked it up, cleaning the mouthpiece with a handkerchief before tucking it into my breast pocket. You can love the roots of a tree while acknowledging that the fruit has turned bitter. I intended to return it to him later, a quiet gesture of a son who still sees the man behind the shadow. Have you ever cared for someone who spent their energy trying to diminish you? It's a heavy burden, but one I've carried since I was old enough to walk. My flashlight beam swept across a stack of modern corporate envelopes tucked behind a crate of my old school trophies. They looked out of place among the 1990s memorabilia. My risk analyst instincts, honed by years of sniffing out corporate rot in Chicago, flared to life. I set the wine bottle down and pulled the top envelope. It was from a local bank, marked with a final notice stamp. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I shouldn't have looked, but the name on the return address was a firm I knew all too well. A predatory lender that specialized in high-interest home equity lines of credit. I opened a folder labeled Home Improvements that had been shoved into the back of the crate. I didn't find receipts for a new roof or a repaired furnace. Instead, I found a second mortgage filing for this Lake Forest estate. Under Illinois law, a primary residence held in joint tenancy requires the notarized signatures of all owners. I stared at the signature line. There was my name, Dallin Vaughn, penned in a script that looked eerily like my own. The date on the document was 2 months ago, a week when I was locked in a boardroom in London. Soren hadn't just borrowed money, he had committed felony mortgage fraud. He was using our parents' home as collateral to keep his crumbling Ponzi scheme from collapsing. The breadth of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Betrayal is never a mistake. It is a series of deliberate choices made in the darkness. Soren knew that if his investments failed, Maris and Vaughn would be homeless within 90 days. He was gambling with their very lives. I didn't scream. I didn't rush upstairs to confront him. I felt a profound, chilling weight in my chest. I pulled out my phone and meticulously took high-resolution photos of every forged page, ensuring the digital metadata captured the time and location. I was no longer just a son at a Christmas party. I was a forensic auditor gathering the nails for a coffin. I stood there in the cold cellar for a long time, the weight of the wine bottle in my left hand and the weight of the truth in my right. I realized that revealing this would shatter the fragile piece of the Vaughn name forever, but keeping it silent would lead to their absolute ruin. Justice is a difficult light. It must be turned on to protect the blind, even if the brightness stings their eyes. I decided right then that I would not play my hand in front of the guests. I would wait. I would let Soren climb just a little higher on his mountain of lies before I pulled the ground from beneath him. I thought of Kaylee waiting for me upstairs. She was my real family now, the only person who saw me for who I truly was. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of a dark window, took a deep breath, and began the climb back to the surface. The warm, golden light of the dining room now looked sickly and artificial against the cold reality of the papers I had just seen. The clinking of glasses from above sounded like the ticking of a countdown clock. I was the only person in this house who knew the roof was about to cave in. As I reached the top of the stairs, the door to the dining room stood slightly ajar. Soren's voice drifted out into the hallway, booming with that practiced, oily confidence that had fooled them all for years. "I've already taken care of the property taxes for next year, Mom," he boasted, followed by the sound of Maris's delighted laughter. "Don't even worry about it. It's the least I can do for everything you've given me." I stepped back into the warmth of the dining room with the precision of a surgeon, the rare bottle of wine clutched in my hand like a cold glass secret. The laughter was louder now, fueled by Soren's latest fabricated tale of a multi-million-dollar merger that didn't exist outside of his own desperate imagination. I looked at my parents, Maris, beaming with a pride that was essentially a loan from a liar, and Vaughn, nodding along to every syllable. A profound sense of pity washed over me. I carried the digital weight of that forged mortgage in my cloud storage, a ticking clock they couldn't even hear. It's a heavy thing to realize your parents have spent their lives worshipping a mirage, while the person actually holding the roof up is treated like an intruder. Have you ever seen a house built on sand? It looks beautiful until the first wave hits. As the house staff began serving the main course, a lavish spread of prime rib and truffles that I had paid for 3 weeks ago, Maris gestured toward my plate with a flick of her diamond-encrusted wrist. "Dallin, don't eat too much," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar, casual condescension. "You haven't exactly earned a meal of this caliber. Try to be grateful that your brother's success covers your seat at this table tonight." A suffocating, awkward silence followed her words. 30 guests stared into their wine glasses, refusing to make eye contact with the youngest son, who had just been publicly told he was a charity case. I remained silent, the silver fork in my hand feeling steady and cold. A man is not hurt by the insults of others, but by his own belief that those insults hold truth. In that moment, I realized I was no longer an actor in their play. I was the one holding the cord to the curtain. I looked at Maris, then at Soren, and finally at Vaughn. I didn't feel anger. Anger is a luxury for those who still have something to lose. I felt a terminal disappointment that liberated me from their expectations. Under the table, I subtly squeezed Kaylee's hand. I leaned in and whispered, "It's time to stop the bleeding, Kaylee. Not for revenge, but because you can't save a house by adding more sand to the foundation." She squeezed back, her eyes reflecting a courage that was far more real than anything else in this room. While Soren leaned back in his chair, regaling an investor with lies about his next global acquisition, I discreetly pulled my phone from my pocket. As the primary holder of the Vaughn Family Trust and the master administrator of the estate's smart grid, I had the legal and technical authority to act. I wasn't being cruel. I was acting as the auditor this family desperately needed. I navigated to the banking app and executed a pre-planned termination protocol. With 3 taps, I revoked Soren's supplementary credit card access and paused the autopay for the forged mortgage I had found in the cellar. Under U.S. financial regulations, the primary account owner has the absolute right to freeze assets when fraud is suspected. I was simply following the law. Money is a good servant, but a dangerous master, especially when it is stolen from those you claim to love. I reflected on the quiet power of withdrawal. I wasn't fighting them. I was simply removing my energy from a toxic system that had refused to see me for 30 years. I watched the small green confirmed light blink on my screen. The digital severing was silent, but I knew the impact would be felt within minutes. I put the phone away and took a slow, calm sip of my wine, watching the room through the eyes of a man who was already halfway out the door. Vaughn stood up then, his face flushed with wine and unearned pride, raising his glass for a final toast. "To Soren," my father proclaimed, his voice booming across the 30 guests, "the sole provider and savior of the Vaughn legacy. We would be lost without your leadership, son." He turned a cold, disappointed gaze toward me, as if my presence were a stain on the evening. I didn't flinch. Instead, a short, genuine laugh escaped my throat, a sound so unexpected and clear that it cut through the artificial tension of the room like a blade. "If Soren is truly the provider you say he is," I said, my voice calm and resonant, "then the bills from now on should be very easy for him to handle." I stood up slowly, the movement intentional and powerful, signaling Kaylee to do the same. The confusion on my father's face was almost comical. Maris's lip curled as she sneered, "What bills? Soren pays for everything. You contribute nothing but spreadsheets and silence, Dallin." The room went dead silent. 30 pairs of eyes shifted between the golden sun, who had suddenly gone pale, and the invisible outcast standing at the end of the table. "You've been living in a dream, Mom," I said, looking at her with a mix of sadness and absolute clarity. "I'm just the one waking you up." I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I turned and walked toward the foyer, Kaylee by my side, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. Behind us, I heard the first "notification declined" sound chirp from Soren's pocket, a small digital herald of the disaster to come. My heart didn't race. I wasn't panicking. For the first time in my life, I felt the profound weight of honor being restored. I reached the heavy oak front door, the freezing Illinois night waiting on the other side. As my hand touched the cold brass handle, I heard Soren's chair fly back in the dining room. He began to scream my name, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. At that exact second, the grand chandelier in the dining room flickered once, hummed with the dying energy, and then plunged the entire Christmas party into total, absolute darkness. "Dallin, what did you do?" Soren's voice shrieked through the blackness, but I had already stepped out into the quiet, falling snow. The heavy oak doors of the Vaughn estate slammed shut behind Kaylee and me, muffled only by the biting Illinois wind that seemed to howl in approval. As we stepped onto the driveway, the fresh snow crunching beneath our boots, I pulled my phone from my coat pocket for one last look. I confirmed the final command: execute master account lockout. Within the blink of an eye, the smart home system, the digital nervous system of that sprawling mansion, ceased to recognize Soren's credentials. I stood there for a moment, watching the grand colonial house fade into a dark, frozen silhouette against the white landscape. Charity is a gift from the heart, but subsidizing a lie is a crime against the truth. I wasn't punishing my parents. I was simply removing the artificial life support that Soren had used to keep them blind. I looked at Kaylee, the glow of the car's headlights cutting through the swirling flakes. "As the primary trustee and owner of the mortgage note Soren forged, I have a fiduciary duty to preserve the assets," I said, my voice as steady as the winter night. If I don't stop the bleed now, there won't be an estate left for them to inhabit in 6 months. I was preserving what remained of their future before Soren drained it into his personal abyss. Have you ever had to be the villain in someone else's story just to save them from their own choices? It's a lonely path, but as Dallin, I had long ago learned that a man's character is built in the shadows, where no one claps. The front door of the mansion flew open, and Soren came sprinting out, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't look like the golden sun anymore. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the cage had just been locked. He cornered me by my car, his breath hitching in the freezing air. "What the hell did you do, Dallin?" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You've ruined the family's dignity. Turn those cards back on right now. Do you have any idea who was in that room?" He was no longer asking. He was demanding a return to the fantasy he had stolen from me. When his pleading didn't move me, Soren's tone shifted into something far more jagged. "You think you're so smart?" he snarled, leaning in close until I could smell the expensive scotch he hadn't paid for. "I've got a dossier of emails and bank logs ready to go. I'll frame you for embezzlement at your Chicago firm before the sun comes up. If I go down, I'm taking your career and your reputation with me." It was his trump card, a final desperate move to blackmail me back into submission. I stood perfectly still, reflecting on the wisdom that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest, while silence is the ultimate fortress. I looked at him with a profound disappointment that cut deeper than any insult. Before I could speak, Kaylee stepped forward from the passenger side, her tablet glowing in her hand. "Every digital transaction has a fingerprint, Soren," she said, her voice calm and clinical. "And under U.S. federal wire fraud statutes, you aren't just a debtor, you're a criminal. I've been recording this entire conversation, including your threat to fabricate evidence." The mask on Soren's face didn't just slip, it shattered. He realized he wasn't playing against an invisible sun anymore. He was facing a professional auditor and his partner. Sometimes, the person who saves you is the one you spent years trying to erase. The porch lights flickered as Maris and Vaughn stumbled out into the cold, shivering in their formal wear. Soren immediately pivoted, using their vulnerability as his final weapon. "Dallin, look what you're doing," he yelled, gesturing wildly at our parents. "Dad can't breathe in this cold. You're a murderer if you don't turn the heat back on." I felt a sharp pang of genuine love for the two people standing there, but I knew I couldn't be manipulated by a staged emergency. I pulled the spare inhaler I'd found in the cellar from my pocket and tossed it into the snow near Vaughn's feet. "I'm not the one who put you in the cold, Dad," I said, my voice carrying across the driveway with a weight that demanded they listen. "I'm the one who stopped the person who was selling your roof from under you while you cheered his name." I saw the confusion in Vaughn's eyes as he picked up the inhaler. I knew the house had enough residual heat to last for hours, and I had already prepaid a hotel suite for them under a private account they could access by phone, a lifeboat Soren couldn't touch. I was choosing to save their future, even if they hated me for their present. As I climbed into the car and started the engine, I looked at the dark mansion one last time. I realized that the only way to save a family that is drowning is to stop being the anchor they drag down with them. Looking back now, I should have felt a sense of victory, but all I felt was the quiet peace of a man who had finally set a boundary that couldn't be crossed. "Don't answer them," Kaylee said softly as my phone began to buzz in the center console. "Let the silence do the work that words never could." Dallin pulled out of the driveway, the red glow of the taillights reflecting off the snow. My phone screen lit up incessantly, the first of 36 calls from family friends, neighbors, and frantic relatives, all orchestrated by Soren in a final attempt to shame me back into the dark. I didn't look at a single one. The red glow of my taillights bled into the swirling Illinois snow, a fading pulse of the life I was leaving behind. Inside the car, the silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the digital storm erupting on the console between Kaylee and me. My phone screen refused to stay dark, flashing incessantly with names I had known my whole life, neighbors, family friends, and distant cousins. Soren was working the room in the dark, weaving a narrative of my cruelty to anyone who would listen. I didn't look at a single one. I kept my eyes on the white lines of the I-94, my grip steady on the wheel. Looking back now, I realized that some bridges need to burn just so you can see your way forward. While I drove through the biting cold, The mansion in Lake Forest had become a tomb of pitch-black chaos. I could almost feel the temperature dropping within those grand walls as the smart home system stood its silent ground. Inside, the residual warmth was evaporating, leaving 30 of Chicago's finest huddled over the weak glow of their iPhones. The catering staff and private security, realizing their pre-authorized payments had been voided, staged an immediate revolt. Under Illinois contract law, they had no obligation to serve a host whose credit was as empty as his promises. They demanded cash on the spot, or they walked. I imagined Soren, the man of the hour, frantically swiping cards that I had already marked as fraudulent. He stood there in the dark, humiliated before the very people he had tried to impress, a king of a kingdom made of nothing but debt. A reputation built on borrowed light will always vanish when the sun goes down, I whispered to the windshield. I felt no joy in their struggle, only a deep, weary confirmation of what I had always known. Soren was never a provider. He was a pauper in a tailored suit. Have you ever watched a facade crumble in real time? It's a chilling sight, not because of the destruction, but because of the truth it reveals underneath. I was no longer the invisible sun. I was the one who had finally turned the lights off on a 30-year lie. The digital onslaught intensified. My phone vibrated against the plastic, a rhythmic reminder of the world Soren was trying to pull me back into. 36 missed calls. Each one was a bullet Soren had fired, hoping to find a soft spot in my conscience. The messages shifted from frantic pleas to outright aggression. A photo came through. Vaughn, my father, huddled in a blanket, his face pale in the camera's flash. The caption from Soren read, "You're committing elder abuse, Dallin. Dad is freezing. I've called the Lake Forest police. I hope you're happy." It was a classic frame-up, a desperate attempt to use the law to force my hand. I looked at the phone and remembered a truth I once read. You cannot be responsible for the storm you didn't create, even if those you love are getting wet. Soren wanted the authorities to believe I was a rogue son who had stolen the family's life savings. He was banking on the local police forcing me to unlock the accounts under emergency provisions. But I wasn't panicked. I kept the phone on silent, trusting the prepaid hotel reservation I had sent to my father's email earlier. That was the only lifeboat I would provide, a clean, warm place away from Soren's influence. If they chose to stay in the dark with a liar, that was a choice I could no longer prevent. "He's calling the police, Dallin," Kaylee said, her voice a calm anchor in the dim light of the dashboard. "He thinks he can use them to bully you." I nodded slowly. Soren didn't realize that in the United States, the law doesn't care about golden suns. It cares about signatures and ledger lines. Kaylee opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face as we reviewed the master audit file. It was a comprehensive map of Soren's crimes: the forged cellar mortgage, the Ponzi shell transfers, the identity theft. We weren't just fleeing, we were preparing for a deposition. Intercut with our quiet escape, I could see the scene at the mansion in my mind's eye. 2 squad cars would be pulling into that snow-covered driveway, their blue and red lights dancing off the white pillars. Soren would meet them at the door, tears in his eyes, spinning a tale of financial ruin and a heartless younger brother. He was weaponizing the very system meant to protect us, unaware that I had already turned that system into a mirror. Kaylee looked at me, her expression soft but resolute. "Are you ready to send him to prison?" she asked. I replied with a heavy heart. "I am not sending him to prison, Kaylee. His actions are. I am simply refusing to lie to a judge to save him from himself." I pulled the car over at a quiet rest stop, the engine idling as I looked at a new notification on my screen. It was a dispatch alert from the Lake Forest PD. The final confrontation was no longer a family squabble. It had become a matter of public record. I realized then that the truth is a lonely place to stand, but it's the only ground that won't give way under your feet. I took a deep breath, the cold air from the cracked window stinging my lungs, and prepared for the final act. I picked up the phone as it began to ring for the 37th time. The caller ID didn't show Soren's name or a neighbor's house. It was the Lake Forest police station. I pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear, my voice devoid of the fear they expected. "Officer, I've been expecting your call," I said. "I have all the documentation you're going to need to understand exactly what happened tonight." "Sir, we have a report of a domestic emergency and massive financial fraud." The officer's voice crackled over the line, professional and stern. "We need you to return to the residence immediately to resolve this matter." The blue light of dawn was just beginning to bleed over the Lake Forest horizon when I pulled back into the driveway. The flashing sirens of the police cruisers had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of professional duty. Soren was still there, his voice hoarse from a night of screaming, pointing at the darkened mansion as if his rage could restart the furnace. I stepped out of the car, followed by my attorney, my breath hitching in the frigid air. A man who stands on the truth has no reason to raise his voice. I didn't feel the need to shout back or defend my character. I simply walked toward the officers with a calm that seemed to unsettle everyone remaining on the lawn. "Officer, I'm Dallin Vaughn," I said, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet morning. Before Soren could weave another syllable of his grand frame-up, I handed the lead officer a thick, leather-bound forensic file. I explained that under Illinois Title 720, I was formally reporting a series of felonies: mortgage fraud, identity theft, and the unauthorized use of a power of attorney. I wasn't reacting to Soren's threats. I was initiating a legal audit that had been 30 years in the making. Looking back now, I realized that the hardest part of standing up for yourself isn't the fight. It's the silence you have to maintain until the evidence is ready. The moment of disclosure arrived with a chilling finality. I opened my tablet and projected the high-resolution photos of the documents I'd found in the cellar. The forged signatures, the Ponzi shell transfers, and the bank logs showing Soren draining Maris's retirement fund to hide his gambling debts. I looked at my parents, who were now silent and trembling on the porch. "I didn't stop the money to hurt you," I said, looking Maris in the eye for the first time without fear. "I stopped it to make sure you still have a house to sleep in next month. If I hadn't acted, Soren would have had you on the street by spring." Even as the officers moved toward Soren to place him under arrest, I felt a strange, lingering sense of mercy. I didn't hate them. I pitied the blindness that had led them to this ledge. I stepped toward my father, Vaughn, and handed him a warm coat I'd brought from the car and a thermos of hot coffee. I wanted him to see that while my boundaries were made of steel, my heart was still capable of the kindness he had forgotten to show me. True strength is found in how we treat those who can no longer do anything for us. Have you ever had to save someone who spent their life trying to break you? It is the most exhausting form of love, but it is the only one that leaves your soul intact. Soren's final stand was a pathetic display of a narcissist realization. He tried to claim I had hacked his accounts, but the forensic trail of IP addresses and the physical forgery from the basement made his defense crumble. The Lake Forest police, seeing the $500,000 scale of the fraud, placed him in handcuffs. The Golden Sun was led away in the back of a squad car, stripped of his stolen Rolex and the false pride he had worn like armor. Maris and Vaughn watched in horror, their world collapsing as they realized their hero was a thief and their outcast son was their only shield. I addressed them both with a stoic dignity that required no effort. "I was never your shadow, Dad," I said quietly. "I was your foundation. But a foundation cannot hold a house that refuses to acknowledge its existence." I explained the terms of the new legal trust I had established. They would live in the house, but the title would be held by the trust for their protection. Soren would never have access to a single cent of their remaining assets again. I wasn't seeking an apology, and I wasn't looking for a reconciliation. I was providing them security because it was the honorable thing to do. True forgiveness isn't about letting toxic people back into your life. It's about letting go of the anger so you can move forward alone. 1 week later, I stood in my high-rise office in Chicago, watching the sunrise over the vast, shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan. The 36 missed calls had stopped. The digital storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt like a sanctuary. Kaylee entered the room, 2 coffees in hand, her presence a reminder that the family you choose is often more sacred than the one you were born into. She had been my anchor when the storm was at its peak, and now we were finally sailing in clear water. I noticed a letter on my desk, a shaky, handwritten attempt at an apology from Maris. I read it slowly, feeling a faint echo of the old pain, but then I placed it down and looked back at the horizon. I understood that healing takes time, and my first duty was no longer to the Vaughn legacy, but to my own peace. My strength didn't come from my bank account or the titles I held. It came from the ability to walk away from a table where love wasn't being served. I realized then that I was finally home, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to pay for the light. I turned off my phone, the screen finally dark and quiet. I placed it face down on the mahogany desk and walked toward the elevator with Kaylee. We left the shadows of Lake Forest behind us, stepping into a future that belonged entirely to us. The elevator doors closed with a soft, melodic chime, sealing away the noise of the past and opening the door to a life where I was finally enough. Standing in the light of my own truth, I realized that loyalty to family should never cost you your soul. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let the house go dark so everyone can finally see who is actually holding the torch. I chose peace over pretense, and for the first time, I am free. But I want to know, have you ever had to draw a line in the sand to save your own life from the people who were supposed to love you? Tell me your story in the comments. I'm reading every one of them.